It's easy to be caught off guard by the high encounter speeds when performing a rendezvous high above Kerbin. That is what we're going to have to do today in order to satisfy the contract, rescue a Kerbal from orbit of Kerbin. I will be showing you some simple techniques for dealing with this high velocity challenge. As well, I'll be going over the build of a rocket capable of performing any rescue within the Kerbin system that the game may throw at you. Let's get started. And here is our contract: rescue the good from orbit of Kerbin. And if the good Kerbin doesn't sound like a very Kerbal name, well, once again, it is one of my wonderful YouTube members or Patreon patrons who help to support this channel. I like to, in my own small way, honor each of them by giving them a Kerbal name, and I'm still working my way down the list. But let's get on with the contract. And the thing I want to draw attention to is that he is stranded in orbit about Kerbin. A lot of the times you'll see the word low, and if it says low orbit, that means that they are in an orbit, usually in around 80 kilometers or so very low orbit about Kerbin. But if it doesn't say low, that means they could be in any orbit about Kerbin, and typically they're up in a pretty high orbit of Kerbin, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. And really this comes down to doing a rendezvous. How to do a rendezvous? How is it different when you're up in high space? Well, the big difference is the relative velocities of the two vessels are going to be much, much higher, and we're going to be dealing with how to do that. But the problem is you can't see the orbit from here. To see the orbit, you need to go to the tracking station. And if we scroll on out, right out here, ignore these ones in low orbit, still got to work on them. There is the goods capsule out in an orbit, getting close to the moon's orbit, about 8.4 thousand kilometers by 8.7 thousand kilometers, and this is pretty typical of the kind of orbits that you see. They're always either a little bit below or a little bit above, sometimes dangerously close to the moon's orbit. The problem is you can't see these orbits until after you've accepted the contract. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to design a craft that is capable of picking up a Kerbal from any orbit, actually all the way out to Mimis's orbit, even though they don't typically go out that far, so that if you get any of these kind of high orbit contracts, you can use this craft to go out and get them. But before we do all that, I do want to show you what tech level I am at as far as the buildings go. It's a Tier 2 mission control, Tier 2 vehicle assembly building, Tier 2 launch pad, Tier 2 tracking station, and Tier 2 astronaut complex. If we go here into the R&D center, you want to be done up until the end of Tier 4. And you also want to have electrics, because I am going to definitely be using these solar panels. We're going to be out there for a little bit. And also, you also want to have the Octo Probe Core. And also I have unlocked Advanced Flight Control. That is for the Advanced Inline Stabilizer, which will greatly help us with our ascent. I also happen to have some nodes unlocked up here that are for small parts that I'm not going to use. So as long as you have Tier 4 and Advanced Flight Control and Electric, you're good. Alright, let's get started with our build. And if you saw last week's episode where I built a moon orbiter and went into polar orbit about the moon, this vessel is exactly that vessel with just the science stripped out of it. But I'll go over the build anyway. We're going to start with a Mark 1 cockpit, and on top of that we're going to put our Mark 16 parachute, and under which is going to go a 1.25 meter heat shield, and then a TD-12 decoupler, a 1.25 meter service bay, inside which is going to go the Octo Probe Core. Now the reason why the Probe Core is actually very, very important is because this thing can only hold one Kerbal. We need a seat for our rescuee, so we're going to be sending this up empty, so it's going to be flying on the Probe Core. So the Probe Core is completely necessary. We're also, for a little bit of battery storage, going to put in a Z200 battery, and for communication, a Commutron 16 antenna. Then to finish off our orbiter, we're going to put on a FL-T 200 fuel tank, followed by an FL-T 400 fuel tank, and then the ever familiar Terrier liquid fuel engine. And then finally for electrics, I've been taking the solar panels and tucking them into here, but I know that bugs some people, so I'm going to actually just simply put 6 of them in and around here. There's no drag associated with these parts, so there's really no reason to tuck them away other than the fact that I think it looks a little bit cleaner, so it'll look perfectly fine this way. As for the lifter, it's going to be identical to the one you saw last episode, starting with a TD-12 decoupler, the advanced inline stabilizer, and then 3 FL-T 400 fuel tanks. Underneath went the swivel liquid fuel engine, and then for a little bit of stability, 4 basic tail fins. This thing is still going to require a couple of liquid fuel radial boosters, so we're going to put those on with a TD-38 decoupler, again just 2 of them, and then a further 3 FL-T 400 fuel tanks for each of the 2 boosters, and then a pair of Reliant liquid fuel engines on the top, the basic aerodynamic nose cone, and then of course a few struts, 4 struts actually, to kind of stiffen this all up. As before, all 3 engines are going to go off at the same time, and as for the thrust limiters, I ended up setting the core at 71.5% and the radial boosters at 67.5%. And that gave me a total vacuum delta V of 5,594 meters per second. So that makes this a vessel that is capable of getting into an orbit all the way out to Mimis's orbit. It's also capable, if you wanted to use it for such, to do a rescue around the moon or a rescue around Mimis as well. And after some texturing and some launch clamps, don't forget we want to send this up with the command seat empty. We're ready to go. So let's go find our target. There it is, the goods capsule. So we'll set that as a target. Now, the good is in a bit of an inclined orbit. Looks like a very similar inclination to Mimis's orbit. I'm going to guess that that inclination is about 5 degrees. Now, a lot of people like to just launch straight into an equatorial orbit, and that is fine, but I like to do the same thing that I do when I go to Mimis. You can check the video out here if you want to look at that in more detail, but I like to launch into an inclined orbit, so I'm going to center my view on Kerbin. We're going to turn this so that the moon's orbit is edge on, and then we're going to rotate until the goods orbit is also edge on. As you can see, I got to be on this side. And we can see here I've got to go towards the north as I launch. We're coming up very close to our launch window. I'm going to estimate that at about 5 degrees. So north 5 degrees from 90s, 85. So I'm going to go up at a heading of about 85, 84 degrees. But first thing I got to do is time warp until we are at our launch window. Ignore these other crafts going around. They're just other Kerbals I have to rescue. I'd say that looks pretty good. Let's go. Once again, once I pitch over, I'm going to try to keep it at a heading of around 84, 85 degrees. And if you're having a little bit of trouble holding on to the heading that you want, don't forget, once you get around a minute to your apoapsis, reduce your throttle. There is a slight fuel efficiency savings when you do that, but I find the bigger advantage is simply that you have much more control of the vessel, especially when you're trying to hit a very specific heading like I am here at about 84 degrees. I also find that it helps me be much more consistent in my orbital insertions. Anyway, that's about an 80 by 80 kilometer parking orbit. Let's see what we got. So you can see here my orbit very close to the target inclination of the orbit. If yours isn't like that, don't worry about it too much. Let's get ourselves out there. Actually, it's going to be very similar to when we go to the moon, because this orbit's very similar to the moon's orbit. It's going to go about a sixth of an orbit along as we make our way out there. So we'll put our maneuver right around there and we'll burn out. And what we're looking for are those close encounter indicators. There they are, right about there. Okay, and I can see I need to be a little bit more this way. I want to bring these as close as I can together while I'm out here. Now, don't expect the separation to be as close as what you get when you're in low orbit about Kerbin. This separation is going to be pretty high. Right now it's about 175 degrees, but let's see if I can get it a little bit better. We'll play a little bit with the widget tool and the timing here. That's worse, so we'll go back in time. Oh, I saw about 96, like that. And you know what? Maybe a little bit more prograde to come out a little bit further. Yeah, that's making it better. That's not at that point, though. And don't get too obsessed about making this perfect at this point. There we go. I saw 91 kilometers. I'm going to leave it at 91 kilometers. We'll do a correction on our way out there. But right now, let's just do that burn. And while you're performing the burn, go over here to the approach info for the goods capsule, and you can keep an eye on your intersect distance. Now, right now, there's NAs here because our orbits aren't crossing yet, but that should change as we get towards the end of this burn. And there we go. You can see here how we got 154 kilometer separation. I'm going to turn down the thrust limiter quite a ways on this. I'm going to ignore the maneuver node. And I'm just going to see if I can, right here, see if we can make this a little bit better. So I'm going to burn a little bit more. Well, let's bring it down. Oh, and then it started to go up. So we're about 96 kilometers. I'm going to stop at that point. Again, there's no sense being super picky about it at this point because we're going to do ourselves a correction. Alright, so you can see here that I am coming a little bit to the north of my target orbit. You might be off by more than that, don't worry about it. We're going to do a correction, put a maneuver at about the halfway point on your way out there. And I can see right away I got to come down a little bit towards the south because I definitely want these two orbits crossing. There we go about that. Now notice that in this case, the DN might be the AN for you, is coming in. I do want that DN right in around where these encounter indicators are. Now, this is going to start getting pretty fine, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to using the little widgety tool. Oh, even like a half made a difference there. Now, in doing so, I did get these to move a little bit further apart. I'm going to right-click on one of them so I can see the separation distance. And the way to adjust the separation distance now is to actually use the two radial components. So check to see, does radial out make this better? So we'll pull up. Nope, that makes it worse. So I'm going to go to radially in. Try and pull those as close as I can. Now, get that. I got this in around, about 51 kilometers. But notice that the DN is now off, so that means I need to play around with the normal and bring that DN back in around here. So let's see, does anti-normal? Oh, it's really small. Let's turn down this. Get that in really close. We got 51 kilometers. Let's play a little bit with the radially. Nope, the other way. So I'm playing a little bit with the widgety tool, just rolling the mouse wheel. Maybe this way? Yeah. Let's see. You know what? I think I might actually give it a little bit of prograde too. I think I'm coming a little bit short of the orbit. So let's see a little bit of prograde. What that do? Oh yeah, a little prograde's making that number smaller. So don't be afraid to play with whatever numbers it takes to bring that number down. And personally now, although it really doesn't matter, I find it hard not to keep going. The one that's the most important is keeping that DN right in around where those close encounters are. You want the two orbits crossing there. Okay, I'm seeing about 10 kilometers. I'm going to call it at that point. 9.8 kilometers. That is perfectly serviceable. Okay, let's get out and do it. It's a tiny little burn, only 18 meters per second. I'm going to put this right on the maneuver node here. Get that direction right. You don't have to worry about this time getting right down to 0. There's nothing precise in the timing of this burn. And you can watch it from out in map view if you want, but personally, I kind of like just watching my intersect distance that the game provides me down here. So I'm just going to just give myself a little bit of throttle, take my time. There's no rush here. I even still have the thrust limiter down quite low. And I'm just watching that intersect distance. You may find there it's starting to creep up again. Don't worry about that. Trust the maneuver. There, it's starting to go back down again. Oh, started to creep back up, so I'm stopping at 9.9 kilometers. Get rid of the maneuver. And let's take a look at our situation. You can see here, we're in this elliptical orbit on our way out. Here's the goods capsule, and we're coming in within 10 kilometers right around here. But the thing to notice is, okay, 9.9 kilometers, that's great, but look at that relative speed, 380 meters per second. That's what makes these high altitude rendezvous so much different than the low altitude rendezvous. When you're in low orbit about Kerbin, your encounter speeds are typically only 2 or 3 dozen meters per second, and it's really easy to do that freehand. At least that's the way I like to do it. But out here at 380 meters per second, that can be hard to do freehand. And the reason why, by the way, that this speed is so much is because our orbits are so different. We're in this elliptical orbit. The good is in this big circular orbit. We're going to encounter each other at very different speeds, and we need to zero that speed out if we want to rendezvous with them. And the easiest way to do that is through the use of a maneuver node. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a maneuver node on my blue orbit ahead of where my encounter is, and then I'm going to move it in really nice and close, and I mean really close like that. Now, one thing I want to draw attention to, let me up the time scale on the widget tool here a bit. If I start popping ahead a little bit in time, a little bit higher on that, I'll get to a point, watch the close encounter indicators, where suddenly they pop, right? They change. See how they change? If I come back, here they're close together, and then all of a sudden I do this, and they jump further apart. And what they're doing is that it's actually showing me what my encounter is like on my next orbit around if I went all the way around and did it again. And that is happening because I have moved the maneuver node past where my encounter is. So you want to make sure you don't do that. So if you see the encounter jump like that, come back. I don't know. I'm going to come back maybe another 30 seconds or so. So I'm a little bit ahead of it. Okay. If I want to match velocities with the goods capsule, what I need to do is match its orbit. If I match the orbit, I'm going to match its velocity. And I can see just by looking at this that I need to burn in a prograde direction on this maneuver node to pull that periapsis up so that these two orbits are coming closer and closer together. And if you notice that my relative speed is now down to 32.5 meters per second. It's coming down lower. Let's push this out a little bit more. Now, I'm not going for an actual match of the orbit. That's not what I'm interested in. All I'm trying to do is bring my relative velocity down and keep this separation reasonable. And to be honest, I'm kind of looking at this right now. 8.9 kilometers and a relative velocity of 24.2 meters per second. I'm kind of happy with that. I'm going to leave it just the way it is. If I can get myself into that situation where my separation is fairly low, but my relative velocity is much lower than it was before, I can correct for everything else once I'm out there. So even though I'm not quite matching the orbit that I'm going for, I'm going to call it just based on that. So what I'm going to do now is just go up there and perform that maneuver. Now, you might find as you approach your target that this will switch into target mode. Don't worry about that. That is perfectly fine. If you switch between orbit and target and surface, notice that although other vectors like the retrograde vector is jumping around, the maneuver node vector is not jumping around. That stays in the same location regardless of what your velocity mode is. So I'm going to keep it on target. That's fine like that. That doesn't mess up the maneuver. And basically, I'm just going to perform this maneuver without looking at anything else. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go. And if you want to, while I'm performing the maneuver, keep an eye on this intersect distance. And in particular, keep an eye on this relative velocity. Reducing throttle here towards the end. And we'll get to the end of this burn. That's good enough, right about there. Okay, so now if I take a look at my intersect distance, I have a 9 kilometer separation. It's coming up in 9 minutes. That's great. That gives me time to think about what it is that I'm doing and talk about what I'm doing. But most importantly, my relative velocity with the target is only 24 meters per second. Now, if we're in target mode, put it on the anti-target icon. That's it, the little purple one right here. And that means that my target is in that direction. We're now directly pointing away from the target. If you don't see any kind of waypoint out here, just hit F4 on the keyboard. That toggles that waypoint on and off. It has a tendency to toggle itself off all the time, which is really quite annoying. But we can see now that it's on, that we are about 15 kilometers away from our target and closing. The other thing to notice is that our retrograde vector is quite a ways off from our target icon. we can push this retrograde vector towards our target icon by simply moving the bird on the nav ball over to the other side. Wherever you put the bird, if you burn, that will push the retrograde icon in that direction. So watch how this works. So I'm just going to put the bird icon here because I want to push the retrograde vector towards the anti-target icon. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a burn. And this retrograde vector is moving in this direction, but notice as well, okay, the intersect distance is being weird right now, but ignore that. Just look at the retrograde icon. That I have actually brought down my intersect distance while doing that to almost 1 kilometer. Right? I can even fine-tune it a little bit more. You can see it's still a little bit off, so we'll do a little bit more burning. Get it so that the right there centered on it. Now my separation is 212 meters. And this is actually what makes doing rendezvous out here far away from Kerbin, there's Kerbin there, much easier than doing it in low Kerbin orbit. In low Kerbin orbit, our paths are so curved that you never end up approaching your target in a straight line until you're very, very close to it. But here, even though I'm about, how far away now? About 13.5 kilometers away, I am still approaching it in pretty much a straight line because out here, space is pretty flat. Not all curvy like it is when you're close in around a parent body, but pretty flat. And that means that it makes it actually, in a lot of ways, a lot easier to do the rendezvous because you can just simply fly straight at your craft. Okay, I'm going to put this onto the retrograde vector. We are now about 19 minutes away. No problem. I'm just going to time warp that away. If I was in low orbit and 20 minutes away and started pulling these kinds of stunts, I would find myself moving away from the target. All the orbital mechanics stuff starts to mess things up. Here I don't have to think about any of that kind of stuff. It's really, really nice. Gravity is not messing me up out here. There we are, about 2 minutes away, and I can see that my retrograde vector has drifted off a little bit. It's because we're closer now. I'm a little bit more finer control, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to again just move the bird icon so it's going to push it towards that, and in doing so I'll automatically be reducing my distance to the target, which is now down to 13 meters. After this, it's just letting my vessel keep getting closer on its own, making tiny little corrections along the way while keeping an eye on the time to intercept. Don't let that get to 0, but also don't push it up past 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, we're about 20 seconds away, so I'm going to do a little bit of a burn. Watch that time. You can start pushing it up a little bit, but don't push it up too far. If you see it getting close to around a minute, stop your burn. Don't let yourself get too far away from the target. Okay, you always want to be moving towards it. If you end up pushing this too much, you'll end up moving away from it. So watch that time. Always make sure it's clicking down. But if you happen to burn too much and end up moving away from the target, simply point the craft at the target and burn until you are moving towards it again. Things are very forgiving this far from Kerbin. And once I'm in really close, like my separation is only going to be 1 meter at closest approach. I actually want to kind of push off a little bit from that, so I actually intentionally push the retrograde vector a little bit towards the side, just so that I'll go to the side of this rather than, right in on top of it. Maybe that's a little bit too far now that I'm looking at it. Whoops. Reduce this thrust limiter. You can turn this down really far if you want to. Some people like to put RCS on the vehicle for this kind of fine maneuvering, and that's perfectly fine. I thought about it, but I thought, you know what? In case there are people out there that don't have RCS unlocked yet, I wanted to show that you can do this fine maneuvering without ever installing RCS on your vehicle. Just turn down that thrust limiter, and you can be as fine as you want. So you can see here we're sneaking in, keeping this right on that retrograde vector relative to our target. We are definitely close enough. Let's just zero this out. So a little bit of a burn here. Watching that relative velocity. 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, 0. Okay. And then what I like to do is I like to stand this up on the north vector so that it's pointing straight up. Like so. And even turn the hatch so that make it as easy for our rescuee as possible. Let's switch over to our rescuee and meet the good Kerbin. The good Kerbin is a scientist. Could always use more scientists. Great. All right, we're going to EVA. Oh, dear. Oh, RCS on. A little bit of physics fun there. We're good. We are good. Let's get over to where the hatch is. Don't forget that rescuing Kerbals is your cheapest way of increasing the size of your Kerbinoc core. Alright, we now have the good Kerbin in our capsule. All we have to do is get them down to the surface, and well, you know how this is going to work. Put this on orbit, put it onto the retrograde vector. We're going to reduce our velocity so that our periapsis ends up into the atmosphere. Let's put that thrust limiter back up. And personally, I shoot for about a periapsis of about 35 kilometers. I find that works well. And while the good Kerbin makes their way home, why don't I use this opportunity to go over the main takeaways from this episode? When setting up an encounter far from Kerbin, expect your closest approach distance to be significantly higher than what you may be used to when rendezvousing in low orbit. After setting up the encounter, use a maneuver node to remove most of the relative velocity with the target. Once that burn is complete, use a series of smaller burns to push the retrograde icon onto the anti-target icon in order to reduce your closest approach distance. All the while, keep an eye on the time to intercept. Don't let it get to 0, but at the same time stop your burn if you're pushing this time up too much. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. Join me next week as I look at performing a first crewed moon landing while still relatively low on the tech tree. I hope to see you then.